Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Ill-Fated Wives of Henry VIII podcast. I'm absolutely delighted to announce today's guest is Sandra Vasoli, who is the amazing author of many books, including Anne Boleyn's Letter from the Tower, which has a second edition, and I believe it's getting a third edition. How are you today, Sandra?
I am wonderful. I'm thrilled to be here, thrilled to chat with you, Emma. Love your wonderful website, podcast, all the offerings that you've been putting out on social media. I'm thrilled to be here, and I always love talking about the Tower Letter. So I think we'll have fun today chatting about it.
Yeah, so today we'll be going to talk about this amazing letter, which has got a bit of controversy, believed to be the last letter that Anne Boleyn ever wrote from the Tower, hence the letter from the Tower. But before we get into that, why don't you tell us about how you became fascinated with Anne Boleyn? What made you first go, this woman is so interesting?
Such a good question. And I find that so many people interested in history and ask each other that. And honestly, I don't know, when was the first moment I learned of her, maybe in a history course, but I do distinctly remember watching Anne of the Thousand Days. And I think Geneviève Bujold's depiction of her inspired so many people to learn more about her. And of course it was filmed at Hever. So, not knowing back then when I saw it, that one day I would go to Hever and be there, which would have been just a crazy thing to have known. But I think it was that portrayal. And then I was just really fascinated. Right after that came a series in the 70s. I think it's called The Six Wives of Henry VIII with Keith Michelle. And it was every Sunday night. It was really good. I loved it, watched it. And by that time I was hooked. So, I started reading. I read Jean Plady's books. I don't know whether you guys know her, but she did some really interesting historical novels back then. And I've just, found her to be utterly fascinating ever since, just like so many other people have been.
Jean Pleedy comment, I absolutely love her books. I know a lot of people probably haven't, the younger viewers probably haven't read her books, but if they want to get into an immersive world, it's definitely that one. And I just actually wanted to ask about this letter because not a lot of people know about this letter, and those who have heard of it are a bit, for a word, suspicious of it in terms of its validity. How did
Mhm.
you first come across this letter, and what inspired you to write about it? What made you feel this is definitely from Anne Boleyn?
Yeah. How did I think, I'm trying to think of how I first learned of it. Probably in Eric Ives' book, The Life and Death of Anne Boleyn. I had heard about it in snippets in various places, but really what went on was I was taking a trip to London. I knew I wanted to go into the British Library. I knew I wanted to go into the archives. I had been there previously. I had gotten my reader's pass and my approval to look at rare documents. And I think on my first trip, I saw a few things, including the prayer book in which Anne and Henry wrote to each other. By daily proof, you shall me find to be to you both loving and kind. I saw that in the original, and it was so amazing. So I was going back to London, and I thought, I want to go into the archives. I want to study something. I want to research something. And I knew that I had to decide ahead of time, because you can't kind of just go in there and say, what do I feel like looking at today? You need to have a plan, and you need to have some idea of what documents you're requesting. And maybe at that point, so this was some years ago, maybe at that point I, was reminded of the letter, and I was really interested in it, very intrigued by it. And I thought, let me see if I can dig up some information about this mysterious letter. So I did some preparation ahead of time, went into the library and started to, with the help of some wonderful archivists there and curators, started to look at material pertaining to the letter. And I think I was in the library for a full day and a half, and I came upon some really, really interesting, surprising information that fueled my research. A lot of the research I did at home, online, but the bulk of it and the most surprising facts were found on that day in the British Library archives.
And in terms of when you found this letter, for those people who probably haven't heard of the letter or seen the letter, it's in burnt fragments. Am I correct?
Yes. When I was there for that period of time, I think I requested to see it and was not permitted because it is so fragile. And I'll tell you about that in a second. But the great news is I am going back in June and I am going to see the letter. I've been in touch with the curator, the wonderful curator of medieval manuscripts there, Dr. Andrea Clark, and she has allowed me to be able to view the letter and also thrillingly view the Kingston letters. The Kingston letters are the reports that Sir William Kingston, who was the warden of the Tower of London, was required to compile while Anne was there. Cromwell told him, you must write down anything and everything she says and give those to me. The reason that they are fragile is because they were part of the Cotton collection. Sir Robert Cotton, who was an antiquarian, somebody who loved and revered important documents and collected them. And he amassed an amazing collection, and it was housed at an estate property in London, the whole collection. And in 1732, there was a dramatic, terrible fire there. So many documents were completely ruined. Some were partially ruined. Apparently, this fire started at night, and once word got out, people came from all over because they knew that there was a collection of priceless documents there. And they went in and they were throwing things out the window. They were landing on the lawn. Apparently, there was a huge then restoration project that was undertaken after that. But this was, the early 1700s. And a lot of these documents were on vellum, so which is stretched animal skin. They melted. And so anyway, the Tower letter and the Kingston letters, which were kept near each other, were burned. So half of them are left. The difference between what remains of the Tower letter and the Kingston letters is that people felt that the Tower letter was important enough that numerous copies were made of what was said before the fire. Not so with the Kingston letters. So we only know what we have left.
So, can you tell us about what this letter contains and, where it might have originated from and why it was found in this collection of priceless letters, really?
So we know that Anne was shocked and surprised to be called in front of the King's Council in very early May 1536, cruelly accused of traitorship and also of betraying her husband with multiple men. The whole circumstance surrounding that, her accusations and her arrest, is, of course, a very interesting story, and not one we can really get into in depth today, but there are so many wonderful writings and podcasts and stories about how that came about. We just know, though, that Thomas Cromwell was like the linchpin in all of this happening, which is not to take away the responsibility of Henry VIII, her husband, because he was certainly complicit in this. But it's my belief that Cromwell created a scenario about Anne that left he knew Henry's vulnerabilities, and he knew that it would put Henry in a position where he would do nothing less than have her arrested. And whether either of them thought at that point that she was going to be put to death or not is open to speculation, but Cromwell wanted her out of the way. She was in his way. It was either going to be him or her. So she was arrested. She was taken to the Tower. She was imprisoned in the same room that she was in prior to her coronation. And she was there with several ladies, none of whom apparently were really close to her. It was told to them that anything that she did, anything that she said would be recorded, and that was to be done by Sir William Kingston, the warden, that they were his instructions. Now she's in the Tower and she is half frantic, half disbelieving of what she's been accused of, because I don't know if there's anybody left today who thinks that she might have been guilty of what she was accused of. And she knew she wasn't guilty. And Cromwell knew that she wasn't guilty. So she's in there, and she did not see Henry, her husband, after he left. It was a tennis match. Somebody came to him, whispered in his ear, reported something. He got up and left with one or two counselors, and off they went. And Anne never saw him again. If we think about what we know today about Anne and her assertive personality, the relationship that she had with Henry, which was tumultuous, passionate, up and down. To me, it's not surprising that she first asked to see him. All of these requests had to be funneled through Cromwell, who was the man in charge, and he said absolutely not. And then I clearly believe that if she was not allowed to see him, she asked to write to him. I think one of the crucial points for me in this story, and that is, would she have just sat back and said, oh, well, then I'll never be in touch with him again? To me, that's not her at all. I don't know. How do you feel about it, Emma?
I completely agree. I mean, if we look at everything we've seen from Anne, she was not one to sit back and just let it happen. I mean, we see it with, how she leaves a Hever when she's clearly not interested in him before their marriage. And she's certainly not going to let him or anyone, including Thomas Cromwell, say, you know what, you can do what you want. I'm going to sit back and let it happen. I completely agree with you in
Right.
terms of she would never have not tried to contact Henry.
I'm convinced of that through and through. And actually, there is some evidence in the Kingston papers where he says that she asked of him, I request of you to bear a letter from me to, and then guess what? It's burned. So you don't know. So in the collection Letters and Papers online, which was transcribed in the late 1800s, or, in the Victorian era, somebody inserted to Master Secretary, I request of you, Mr. Kingston, to bear a letter from me to, and then it's burned, and they have inserted Master Secretary. I don't think it was Master Secretary. I think it was to the king. Nobody will ever know because it's gone. My belief is that she wanted to write a letter to her husband because their marriage had not yet been annulled. This is like May 2nd, May 3rd. In the Kingston papers, it says, Kingston reports to Cromwell, Madam, tell it me by your voice, and I will do it. I think what happened was that she was allowed to dictate her thoughts. The letter itself, as people will come to know once they do any investigating into it, it's not in her handwriting. So we know that, and that is acknowledged. What we have left are the words that are uttered, and do they sound like what Anne would have said, and just the whole context of what she is reporting to him. Let's assume then that she was permitted to dictate something, and then we get into who would have written those words. The paper that is actually the burned paper that is actually in the British Library, was that the actual paper that was written on when she dictated? Or is it a copy of what she might have dictated? And there it is it's a conundrum because there are clues that make you think it was the actual paper that upon which, or the parchment upon which her words were written. And then there are some things that allow people to say it's not. And then we also get into were these even Anne's words? My firm belief is that they were Anne's words. When you start to really dig into and look at the way what scribes meant in the 16th century, and how nobles, people who knew how to write, royals, and writing to them was sort of a pedestrian affair. So even though they knew how to write, very well, they would have employ scribes or amanuenses, that's what they were called, to do the writing for them while they dictated. That was very, very common. And apparently, the good scribes not only were quick and had good handwriting, but they knew how to take words. So if we think about me talking now, I mean, I'm talking relatively fast, not terribly fast, but any person who would be writing would not be able to get every single word that I have said. But in other words, they'd be able to capture the thoughts really well. I only learned this not that long ago. I thought, oh, it was scribes who would take down the meaning and the words. And then, of course, the person who had hired the scribe would look at it, make corrections. And then that's the document that then a good copy would be made of that. And that's what would be sent out, which actually is one of the reasons why Henry's love letters to Anne are so unusual, because I've seen many documents that he wrote, and I've seen ones that he corrected. It was unusual for him to do that. And his handwriting was cramped. It all slid up to the right, like all the lines so you could see he was very capable of writing, but he wasn't used to doing it, and he didn't really like it. So now we have a scribe who is taking down the essence of what she's saying. Such an interesting story, and you kind of have to use your detective skills, because there are certain things. I think that's how it is with history. In the art of history, we have certain facts that we might know, either from a document or multiple people reported on those facts. Somehow you have to piece those together. And it's the same way with, like, let's say a murder investigation or a crime investigation. Nobody was there really to see it. So you've got to make assumptions from point one to point two. This should have happened, or this could have happened, or this seems logical. If we agree that she would have wanted to write to him and that she asked Kingston if she could, don't forget, she was still queen. So Kingston, or Cromwell, did not have the authority to say, no, you may not communicate with the king. She was still his wife. She was still the queen. She outranked them. They would have had to have said yes in some capacity. But it's my belief that Cromwell, at this point, she was imprisoned, and it would have been like an imprisoned, like a tiger behind a cage. If he did anything that would jeopardize her being in there and she would be let out, it wouldn't have gone well for him. I mean, she would have come right after him. So now he's in a position where she's there. He can't allow her to write a private sealed letter to her husband, because what if her husband read it and now was like moved to let her go free? Whether he would have taken her back as a wife or not is questionable. He had Jane Seymour waiting in the wings, but maybe he would have let her go free. Maybe he would have done the same thing like Anne of Cleves, and that wouldn't have gone well for Cromwell. So Cromwell absolutely would have refused to let her write anything privately. So, this is where my belief is that he sent someone with a scribe to the tower to let her express herself. And we know that she says in the very beginning of the letter, beside, Sir, your grace's displeasure and my imprisonment are things so strange unto me as to what to write or what to excuse, I am altogether ignorant. Whereas you send unto me, in parentheses, willing me to confess a truth and to obtain your favor by such a one whom you know to be my ancient professed enemy. And then she goes on to say, I no sooner received this message by him than I rightly conceived your meaning. If, as you say, confessing a truth indeed may procure my safety, I shall with all willingness and duty perform your command. So there's a couple really interesting facts in that. And the one that we're going to talk about is she says, you sent my ancient and professed enemy to me. First of all, that sounds very much like Anne, like what she would have said, and not like what a forger would have come up with. And so, who was the ancient and professed enemy? We know by Kingston's reports that Cromwell never visited her while she was there. She says, I am surprised that Master Secretary never came to see me. I'm not surprised because he wasn't going to go in there,
I wouldn't be either.
right? He wasn't going to go in there and have a little chit chat with her at that point. He left everything to Kingston.
Yeah, and he wanted her down. He wanted her gone. So there's no way he was going to
Right,
visit her.
right.
No way.
So then we think, who was her ancient and professed enemy? And in my research, I tried to go through everybody I knew who would have been a sufficient rank to be allowed in there and who was somebody that she knew who plotted against her. We know that Charles Brandon was not a fan of hers. I don't think it was him for many reasons. Sir Nicholas Carew, the master of the horse, he was not in favor of her. But who would have been at a level and of a knowledge of what was going on that would have been her ancient and professed enemy? And I can only come up with one person. And this is what's in the new edition. And that, I think, was her uncle, Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk. They were at odds for a long time. He was part of the entire debacle of arresting her, of accusing her at her trial, and he hated her and he wanted her out of the way. I think that's who was sent to the tower. And I think he brought with him one of his employed scribes or secretaries. And I think he stood there over the two of them while she dictated what she was going to say. And it must have been horrible for her because she was going to express herself, the depth of her heart, in front of her uncle, whom was not supportive. And it also aligns with the fact that they sent women who were not her friends, not her colleagues, not supportive of her, to watch over her, that Cromwell would have sent him. I think that's what happened. I think the scribe was there. They took her words. People who are listening can certainly read the text of the letter, but there's so much in there that's just really, I think, so indicative of where they were, husband and wife, and what they had been through. And she begs for the lives of the men that she now knows have been arrested, not her own. And she says, I know that you loved me. And if you did, and if the name Anne Boleyn was ever pleasant in your ears, then please release these men. She says that I was nothing when you met me, and now I know that you have someone else. So, I mean, these are really just kind of intimate, but very believable expressions. I think that she would have wanted to articulate to her husband at that time.
And the words in the letter are so passionate and they're so Anne in the way that they've been written. And you speak about how she begs for the lives of the people that have been arrested, these innocent men, her brother. What did
Mhm.
you think that the overall importance of this letter was? What was Anne hoping to achieve with this letter? If not to save her life? Was it to save the lives of her daughter? Was it to preserve her reputation? What was it in your mind that she was aiming with this letter?
That's really such a good, thoughtful question. I mean, I look at it and I think she may have been well aware at that time that it was, even though we hear that she hoped, even on the scaffold, that maybe Henry would have saved her. I don't know. I mean, I think that she was realistic to know that things were really dire. So I do think that part of the letter was to beg for the lives of the innocent men. I think the other thing was she just had to speak with him. She had to say to him, I don't even know what's going on here or why, why you would have done this because I am innocent of this, and how could you believe this of me when you know I have loved you? Because I do believe she absolutely loved him. She grew to love him. And this is, that this is not me. And I know that you have someone else now. So, that's such like a woman thing. It's like, damn you, I know you've got someone else, and probably you're not going to come back to me, but I want you to know how I feel and how I've been. So I think it was an expression, something that she had to say to him, stuff that she had to say to him, whether it saved her or not. She does not mention Elizabeth in there. I'm sure that she wanted to say what she wanted to say for the sake of her daughter. It doesn't read like she's hoping that he's going to let her out. It doesn't really read that way. And she does talk about, I pray for you because you're making such a mistake that soon we will all be in front of our maker. And I know I'm good, but if you continue this down this path, you're not good. So I worry for you. And I think that that is just like such a complex thought and so Anne-like. And then, of course, we have this piece that is so interesting. And really, there are many people who believe that at least these were her words. If it was not the actual, as I said, parchment upon which it was written on the 6th of May, 1536, it would have been a copy that would have been made immediately after. But there are people who say, I mean, there are actually historians who say that it's a Victorian forgery, which I don't understand because it was burned in 1742. So that's a little bit before the Victorian era. So the paper that exists in the British Library is not Victorian de facto.
Which makes no sense in a
It
sense.
doesn't, it
You can't just
doesn't.
you can't write something and then just burn it and be like, oh yeah, it's Victorian.
I know, yeah.
Did they
So
think that it was made in the Victorian era? Someone wrote it in, the Tudor style and then burnt it and, manufactured it to look like it was like 100 years old. I don't think
right.
anyone would have done that in their
No,
right
and the thing
minds.
is, it's that we know the Kingston letters are in his hand. There's no debate about those. And guess what? Because the letters were right next to each other in the collection, the burn marks are exactly the same. So that proves that this letter was adjacent to the Kingston letters, which were original at least in 1732. So before that, we don't know. And of course, then there's an interesting thing about Cromwell having that in his papers, but there's a postscript. So if you look at the letter, you see that it's on the first page, and then when you turn the page over, there's a section down below, and the way it was folded was typical of the time. There is, what I've called in my book, there's a postscript that was added. And so when we hear her say in the first paragraph, whereas you send unto me by such one, my ancient and professed enemy, I no sooner received this message by him than I conceived your meaning, and as if you say, confessing a truth may procure my safety, I shall, with willingness and duty, perform your command. Okay, so we look at the postscript on the other side, and the pictures of it are in my book. It says on the other side, the king sending a message to Queen Anne, being prisoner in the Tower, willing her to confess the truth. She said she could confess no more than she had already spoken. And she said she must conceal nothing from the king, to whom she did acknowledge herself so much bound for so many favors. And then this is kind of like a famous, people know this, for raising her first from a mean woman to be a marquess, next to be his queen, and now, seeing he could bestow no further honor upon her on earth, for purposing to make her by martyrdom a saint in heaven. So that last phrase, first of all, is a very like snarky Anne. It's like, okay, thank you. You took me from being like a plain woman, then you made me a marquess, now you made me a queen. But guess what? Today or in the next few days, you're going to make me a saint because you're going to make me a martyr. But you see here that it says the king sending a message. So if we picture Thomas Howard coming in and saying to her, the king, quote, demands that you confess. You've already said what you've thought, but this is your last chance. You confess the truth, willing her to confess a truth. And then I think this is really interesting. The writing on the other side of the letter says, she said she could confess no more than she had already spoken. So now I'm picturing Howard and his secretary there, and they're asking her, and she's saying, I have already confessed the truth. And so they're writing, she said she had already confessed the truth. It's not she wrote or it's she said. So somebody went in, questioned her. That's what she says in her first paragraph. Her response is, I've already confessed the truth. And by the way, let him know that I am grateful because he raised me from a mean woman to a marquess, etc. So the postscript is, this was her response when questioned. And now there are people, paleographers, historians who have said, and then there is, and of course this is burned, then there's like something that almost looked like an address, and it says the lady, and then it's burned, to the king his grace, and it's burned, of the tower. So those words, I have had a number of paleographers say they look very contemporary to the early, 16th century, the 1530s, and that those words are very characteristic of what might have been addressed.
That's one of the things that when we look at Tudor letters is making sure that they are of the language, the structure, even just the way that they've been written is of the time. So you've had people tell you that this letter has to have been from the 16th century, correct?
So I've had a number of paleographers look at the handwriting, because when I first started doing research on this, I thought, we know the handwriting's not Anne's, but I thought, well, maybe we could match it with somebody who would have gone there. So, not really paying that close attention to her word, like that you sent me in my ancient and professed enemy. At first, I thought maybe it was Rafe Sadler, who was Thomas Cromwell's right-hand man, but it's not a match with his. Then I looked at so many other handwritings, and because I'm not a paleographer, and it is very difficult to match handwriting. And what I learned eventually was that there were very few paleographers who would say, this is an exact match, so it had to be this person. You just can't do that. I looked at a number of other, handwritings who you might have thought, and I've looked closely at various samples of Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk. It's not his handwriting. But I have had esteemed paleographers say that it could clearly be of that era, and that it is handwriting that is a combination of secretary hand and scribal hand. So it's not like a beautiful, good copy of a letter that a professional scribe would have sent out. It's a little rougher than that, but that makes sense. I mean, if you have a scribe there with, let's say, the Duke of Norfolk, and he is taking down the words of a queen who is imprisoned, that would be a little nerve-wracking. That could affect the way the handwriting looks. But I mean, I have had people say that it looks like that era. And then there are others who say less about the handwriting, but there are some who say the syntax and the words they don't think look like Anne's or of that era. I mean, personally, I disagree. I think it feels to me so much like what we knew of Anne. And, then there have been comparisons to her trial speech and her scaffold speech. But again, nobody had like their smartphone recording it. So any transcription that we get today would have been, I remember I heard her say this, so I'm writing it down. Would not have been a word for word accounting. And I don't know, just to me, they sound like sentiments 100% that would have come from her in that circumstance.
What's beautiful to see, Sandra, is the amount of research and passion you clearly have for this letter. And I just wanted to ask, what further research or further testing are you going to do to try and prove that this is Anne Boleyn's letter?
Also should mention that how did the letter get in the British Library, which is sort of interesting thing, and we don't really know. And I did propose a provenance because it kind of like just opened up to me. Honestly, I looked at Sir Robert Cotton because it was in his collection, and he was the founder of the British Library Archives. As I said before, he had amassed an amazing collection. And you can trace his collection back in a direct way to the earliest known comments on this letter. And one of the earliest known copies, which is in the British archives, we think was written by a scribe known as the Feathery Scribe. He had a very unique way of writing. And also another one had at the top of it that this letter was found in the papers of Thomas Cromwell after his death. So that's really, really interesting. So why is that? And why was that? And I did have a dialogue with Professor Dr. Diarmaid MacCulloch, who wrote amazing biography of Cromwell. And there are some things in his research and in his findings which correlate, I think, to this directly. Cromwell kept his papers in a very organized way, his inbox, his outbox, and then he had apparently a stash of private and very personal documents. And that is where this letter was found. Whether it was a copy or whether it was an original, we don't know. But what that tells us is the king never saw it. He never gave it to the king. And why would he? Why would he have given Henry something that might have touched Henry's heart to say, I'm going to let her go? So it was found in Cromwell's papers, which after his death, interestingly, when he was imprisoned, he wrote several letters from the Tower himself to the king, and in it he begged for mercy for his own life, which makes me really mad at Cromwell.
Very different from Anne. I think it's because he knew what he put Anne through and he wasn't going to have it.
Exactly.
And he didn't have the kind of, I want to say, delicacy, because Anne had a way of talking to people in a way that made it subtle what she wanted, but without directly asking. Well, Cromwell is blatantly asking for his life. He
Exactly.
knows that he's on thin ice.
Exactly. And it's said that Cromwell's letters Henry read several times and he almost capitulated, but then he didn't. So, yeah, isn't it interesting that Cromwell would have known, potentially would have known that he had Anne's letters stashed in his private papers? So, Dr. MacCulloch says that immediately upon his death, Cromwell's death, somebody, and it was probably Sadler, because I think Sadler was the first one who got a copy of this, went in. He was Cromwell's executor. He would have known where all of Cromwell's private papers were. And before the crown, before, representatives of the crown could have come in and seized Cromwell's estate, Sadler cleared out the papers, the things that would have been incriminating, the things that he hadn't handled, the things that Henry didn't know about. It's my belief that it was Rafe Sadler who first got a copy of this, and then was dear friends with William Camden, left the letter to him, and William Camden left it to Cotton. And there is a very clear, logical line there of what could have happened with this paper. And let's face it, there has to be a way that it got into the archives. We don't know how, but this seems to me to be very logical, and to others as well. In the future, I mean, I don't know. I did spend a lot of time, and I could spend more time looking at handwriting samples of the various secretaries to Thomas Howard. And I was really gung-ho about that for a while. But, but it's super time consuming. And it's also difficult. It's like, if you write a letter or a page of writing, and then, whatever, a month later, you write that same page, is it going to look exactly the same? No, it's really not. I mean, at this point, my handwriting is so bad because all we do is type that, but it's not, it would not be the same. So I think that that's probably a very difficult approach. So I am going to be able to see the letter. I did get permission to see the letter itself, which I'm very excited about. I'm going to do that in June, going to go over. I'm also going to look at the Kingston letters, because I really do believe that she asked Kingston if he would bear a letter to the king. And I would like to at least, if not disprove, at least debunk what history has told us. And we all know, like, history is a little bit of whisper down the lane. It's like somebody says something and it makes sense. So then somebody else repeats that, and somebody else repeats that and repeats that, until now it's like accepted as fact, but it might not be fact. And so I think, people have thought that that report of Kingston says, I desire you to bear a letter from me to Master Secretary. But I don't even, why would she be writing to Cromwell at this point? Anyway, maybe she would have, but no, she wanted to communicate with her husband, without a doubt. So I'd like to look at that part of that actual letter and see if, when you look at documents in the original, it's much different than looking at them on a screen, just to see whether, anything could be verified. And I'd also like to know if the parchment or the paper upon which the Kingston letters are written is the same as the Tower letter. It might not be, because if there was a scribe who came in with Howard or whomever, they might have brought their own paper, or there might have been paper for her there anyway, for her to write whatever she wanted to write. But I don't think they allowed her. I don't think they allowed her to write anything, in case it might have been smuggled. So is the paper the same? Are there watermarks? There has been some research recently in looking at what the watermark of the Tower letter. I will be looking at that as well, and seeing what information I can glean, comparing the Kingston letters to the Tower letter, see what comes up. I think the letter speaks to all of us, and I do think it's some of the last words that we have from Anne to Henry. Of course, her trial was after that, and so there are words from her then, but we know the ending of the story. It's not a happy one.
I did want to ask, because you just mentioned something that I'm very keen to ask you about. You talk about how when Cromwell was imprisoned, he obviously had these very personal letters that would have contained things that Henry didn't know about. And we hear a lot about Henry's great grief, about how
Right.
he's on his deathbed, and he reportedly said that he regretted the injuries he had done to the Lady Anne Boleyn and her daughter. If Henry had gotten possession of these letters, perhaps the one we're talking about, do you perhaps think that this might have added to his great grief, this belief that he regretted what he did to Anne? And do you believe that this great grief was actually said by Henry? Do you think that he would have regretted Anne's death on his deathbed?
It is really very interesting, because obviously when the Tower letter was recovered from Cromwell's papers by whomever, Henry was still alive. Would Henry have at that point seen it? I don't know. That's really maybe. I actually, truthfully, hadn't really thought about that before, but it is an interesting concept. And maybe he would have seen it. Yeah, I mean, so where did this whole thing about his grief come from? And honestly, the day that I was in the British Library and I was digging around for stuff about the Tower letter, anybody who had early people who had written about it or copied it or whatever, I came upon a book that was a compilation of information by antiquarian by the name of Bishop White Kennet. He was a very knowledgeable an antiquarian who also had great respect for interesting documents, which, by the way, that's the other thing. You have all of these antiquarians who saved, copied, referred to the Tower letter. Would it have been an obvious forgery? I mean, they were pretty smart about, real documents and those that had been forged. I don't think so. But anyway, in this book of notations, by Bishop White Kennet, I'm paging through. I see that Bishop White Kennet has written, the king acknowledges with great grief at his death the injuries he had done to the Lady Anne Boleyn and her daughter, as Teve in his cosmography, a writer in no way partial, hath testified. And I thought, my gosh, what is this? So I started digging for that, and I found that Andre Teve was a Franciscan friar. He was a little bit younger than Henry, but he was contemporaneous to him. He was born in 1516. And he was a very interesting character. He traveled all over the world. He ended up being the main kind of confessor and the main cleric to Catherine de' Medici in the French court. He was her chaplain. I mean, he carried a lot of credibility. He did have some naysayers, but then who doesn't? Anybody who publishes. And as I said, he traveled to South America. I mean, it's crazy when you think about it at that time. And he wrote a lot. One of the giant treatises that he wrote was about his travels, but then it included like some historical references. Wrote about a period of time in the history of Henry VIII. And so, I researched him and I took a look at the quotation. But then later, and that this is in the second edition of this book, I found the exact place in the cosmography, which is all in Old French, and I was able to get it translated the few pages before and the few pages after his reference. I thought it's really interesting because the rest of it is all like this happened and this happened and this happened. And then on the 19th day of January, the Count of Sorel died, and then this happened. But then he gets into this piece about Henry. In this Cosmographie Universelle, Tave is giving facts about what happened. On this day, this happened. On that day, this person died. On this day. And then he gets into the small paragraph in which he talks about Henry, and it's distinctly different. It's like it's editorial, so he makes comments about it. And what he says, this is Tave's quote. So he says, on the 28th of the month in the said year 1547, King Henry, died, having reigned 39 years. Several English gentlemen have assured me that he had great repentance for the offenses committed by him against the said Royne, Queen Anne de Boleyn, falsely defeated and accused of what was imposed on her, and died. This is Anne Henry, and died. Oh, she and died very good Christian, and was buried according to the ceremonies of the Roman Church. In this case, it is commendable that, beside being a good warrior and a man of high heart, he loved letters. So he uses the word Several English gentlemen have assured me. How could this have happened? Well, there was a friary at Greenwich, a Franciscan friary. In fact, Henry VIII's father supported it financially, and that's probably where Henry was christened. And we think that's where Henry and Catherine of Aragon were married, in that priory, in that church. And so is it feasible? Is it likely that Andre Tavay spent time there at that Franciscan friary at Greenwich? Sure, why not? In fact, maybe we could find that he did, but I have not been able to do. That's a lot of research, and I haven't, been able to do it. But if he was there and he became acquainted with various high-ranking nobles who would have known Henry, then it's very feasible. Or he totally made it up, which I don't know why he would have done that. But I think the important part is it doesn't say that it was on his deathbed. Because the counterpoint that people will bring up is like, we know exactly, we know who was in Henry's room as he was approaching death, and that they called for Cranmer, and Cranmer came, but by the time he came, Henry couldn't speak. He just says that several English gentlemen have assured me that he had great repentances. It doesn't say that it was like on his deathbed. And if you think about it, as he got older and he knew he was going to die at some point, the concept of heaven and hell was everything back then. Why would he have not reflected on things that he had done? Yes, there were a lot of, another counterpoint is people say, well, why wouldn't he have been upset about Catherine Howard or Sir Thomas More? Maybe he was. There were people that he loved that he had put to death. Maybe he was. Maybe this was just one aspect of what was mentioned to people that he was close to who knew Andre Tavay, and they passed that word along. It's just an interesting passage because it says that he knows that she died a good Christian. And then it says she was buried according to the ceremonies of the Roman Church. Well, she really was not. She was put in the, chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. I don't think really Henry, at that point, Henry didn't want to know anything about the actual death of her because he was a great compartmentalizer. And now he was paying attention to Jane, and he didn't ever want to look at any of the ugly stuff. He left that to his people. And then Tavay says about Henry, in this case, it's commendable that beside being a good warrior and a man of high heart, he loved letters. Interesting. Maybe it was commendable because he regretted. So, and then we know that he did reverse the ban on Elizabeth as part of the succession before he died. So he obviously had some reflection in that regard.
Do you think that he was at a point in his life where he's seen so many people that he's cared about put to death on his own orders? He's seen perhaps people who have actually betrayed him. He knows they've betrayed him. And then we see Anne Boleyn, and he perhaps regrets the fact that he knows that he had a part in her death. He knows he did wrong. And that's perhaps why it's mentioned, because not of the fact that perhaps he said it, but perhaps it had such an impact. She was perhaps the first person he had put innocently to death.
I definitely think that. And I also think that overriding all of this is, this is my belief, and many people may vehemently disagree with me, but I've spent time with the love letters on 2 occasions, and I took a lot away from that experience. And I really believe that he was madly in love with Anne. I think she was the first person that he fell truly in love with. I think he loved Catherine, but that was more of an arranged marriage, and I think he grew to love her. But I think he was swept off his feet by his love for Anne. And then we can get into what went wrong, etc. But I think after her death, he believed, no problem, I'm going to be able to find another wife whom I love just as much, who will give me a son, and all will be well. And he never did. I don't think there was a subsequent wife. Did he love Jane? he was nasty to her sometimes publicly. We know that. She did give him a son who then died. Nobody else was able to do for him what he had hoped that Anne would do. I think she was the love of his life, if that is true. And, you do have many, many people who will say, oh, he was a tyrant from the get-go. And, he actually plotted her demise even when they were going together. And all of that becomes very, very complicated and not doesn't ring true for me. But I don't find it surprising at all that he would have regretted or felt sorrow for what happened and was afraid that, she even said to him in her letter, you are going to be, I fear for what's going to happen to you after your death when you meet your maker, because you're making a big giant mistake.
I think for Henry, love was subjective to him because if we like, there's a lot of argument over who, as you said, Henry's great love was. But I think for Henry, love was different. I think he, like you said, he grew to love Catherine of Aragon because it was arranged. I think for him, there was a difference between romantic love and like royal love in a sense, if that makes sense, because
Yes.
Catherine was his perfect queen,
Yes.
apart from the fact that she obviously didn't give him a son. But in his, if you look at the early stages of the reign, she did give him a son. He sadly did pass away very early on in life. There's that love. And then there's Anne, who's kind of like his boyish love because he hasn't been allowed to fall in love as a prince was because he was a prince before a king. Right. And then there's Jane, who gave him the son, which is practically the embodiment of a queen. That's their one like type. So that's kind of in a way of how Henry is, isn't it? He's regretting perhaps the one. If we look, we could arguably say Catherine Howard was also a true love like Anne, but Anne was like his proper love. So that's probably a big factor in why he regretted her death.
I think you put that so well. I mean, it is such a complicated thing. I think, it's very hard for us sitting here today, you and me, and anybody else, to even remotely conceptualize what it felt like or what it meant to be king. So that in and of itself is like, there's nothing that I do wrong because I am at the right hand of God and he gives me permission to do whatever I feel is necessary. That was overriding. Yet he did, of course, have human emotions. I mean, yes, I think he clearly had a love for Catherine, but that started to wane. And then, bam, he meets Anne. And for anybody who has had that, like, wow, you fall in love and it's all you can think about and you're obsessed. And that's how it was for her. With Catherine Howard, I mean, I think that was, he felt like she was going to be able to, she was going to be able to revive his youth, which was false. He was in love with her like, I'm as desirable as I used to be. And, this is great. But that was false. And so he had a huge, fragile ego, and anybody betrayal was one of his sore points. One of my theories clearly is that Cromwell knew how to hit his most vulnerable area, and that was his manlyhood and his virility. And as he got older, maybe his virility wasn't as consistent as it had been. And people got to know about that. And so now Cromwell comes in and it's like, look, guy, dude, she's having relations with some of your younger friends who are a little bit more capable than you on every instance. And that sent him over the edge.
And it's perhaps the fact that like he doesn't want to admit that being a king makes women want you just as much as you being youthful or thorough. So perhaps he just didn't want to deal with that. And he was like, this young woman wants me. I'm as attractive as any other man, which I'm sorry to say, Henry, you were not.
Right.
He was not.
You may have been in the past, but it's not that way anymore. Absolutely. Absolutely. It's complicated, and it is really always, I think, what I find fascinating about historical research is looking at the facts or the, we'll call them facts, looking at the things that we've been given through documentation or eyewitness reports. But then you have to apply human nature to that. And human nature is, really, it doesn't change. I mean, love is love, jealousy is jealousy, hatred is hatred, passion is passion. And it may be expressed verbally in different ways now than it did then, but the emotions were the same, the feelings were the same, the intensity of them, is the same. And so, why would you not have somebody who would feel nervousness, anxiety, regret over wrongs that he knew that he committed? And it's the eternal story. This is why everybody loves the story of Anne and the story of Henry. And it's just never going to go away because we were not there, and we're never going to know the absolute truth.
And that's actually leading me to my final question for you, which I think a lot of our viewers are probably wanting to know, considering your amazing work on the letter. Is there another letter or area of Anne's life that you're wanting to look into after you finished this new edition with your book?
Oh, that's such a nice question. Thank you. Well, the project that I have underway, not too far underway, but I really hope that I'm going to be able to complete it within, like, let's say 18 months, is I am writing a book which will be a personal essay on my visits to the Vatican Library and the time that I've spent with the love letters right in front of me, touching them, looking at them, reading them, which truly was, I mean, in terms of scholarly pursuit, was the most amazing, they were the most amazing moments in my life. And they really were amazing. And the entire, kind of aura of the Vatican archives and what goes on there and how it is to get in there, how difficult it is to get in, how, once I had these letters in front of me, the feeling that they were written for Anne's eyes only by Henry. And now here I am 500 years later, some woman from Gwinnett Valley, Pennsylvania, USA, is sitting there looking at them. It was just overwhelming to me. And I will say that I came away on my first visit, which was in 2014. I went in feeling a certain way about the story of Anne and Henry, that she kept him at bay, that, she felt a certain way and that he felt a certain way. I came out of there that afternoon with a completely different feeling. And I will say that the aura that comes from those letters is powerful. It's real. It's something that you cannot get from looking at them on a digitized copy. And so then I went back some years later and studied them again, had the same kind of experience. And, so now it's been several years and I've thought about the whole process of getting in and seeing them and I knew that I had to write about it. So I will be doing that. And it is going to be, this was my experience. So I'm not going to say, this is what the letters prove, because everybody has their own belief and they're entitled to their own belief. But I am going to, that's why it's going to be a personal essay. It'll be, this was my journey. This was what it was like trying to get into the library, getting in, being there that day, being so nervous that I couldn't even get a drink of water or go to the bathroom because I was afraid I was going to miss them. And what I saw and what I felt and how it impacted my beliefs afterwards. So that's what I'm working on. Wish me luck. It's really not going to be, it's not the easiest thing, but I intend to do it and I will get it done. And I will let you know as soon as it's done.
I will definitely need a copy of that. I think
You'll be
that
getting.
we are not lucky as you to be able to go to the Vatican or the British Library. So this will be definitely a book that all of us will need to read. And for people who haven't read any of Sandra's books, which is a crime, in my opinion, I would definitely recommend starting with her book, Anne Boleyn's The Letter from the Tower. That is an amazing book. And for people who aren't aware about the letter or don't perhaps know a lot about Anne's time in the Tower, it's a perfect book for you. It's not confusing in any sense of the manner, which you can find in a load of history books, but you've made it so easy to read and simplistic, and it's in an elegant way. It's not dumbed down for people. It's able to read it from expert to novice. And I just want to thank you so, so much, Sandra, for joining me today, for allowing me to talk to you, and for talking about this absolutely amazing letter.
Emma, thank you so much. I thoroughly enjoyed our chat. Let's do it again. Let's do it when, I'm underway with the letters, the love letters book. And, I'm always happy to get into any kind of debate or questions. So if you have a way that any of your, readers or listeners want to ask questions, let's get into an interesting kind of back and forth with them. I'm always happy to do that.
I definitely will. And I think what we will do in the description for this video is we will put the link to this book as well as your other books. And if anyone has any questions that they would like to ask Sandra, please feel free to put it in the comments. I think we need to make sure that a load of people are more knowledgeable of this letter and of other parts of Anne's life. So I just want to thank you again, Sandra, and thank you to all my listeners for listening. This is the Ill-Fated Advisor of Henry VIII signing off.